There is a moment it does not announce itself. There is no argument, no dramatic confrontation, no final conversation where everything is laid out on the table. One day, you are present, you are warm, you are trying, and then quietly, without warning, even to yourself, something inside you closes. Like a door that was left open for years, finally, gently clicking shut. And the person on the other side does not even hear it happen. This is what people who have never experienced it do not understand. They think the empath left because they were angry. They think something snapped. They imagine a moment of rage, a final betrayal, a line crossed so loudly that the exit was obvious. But that is almost never how it happens. The empath did not leave in a moment of fire. They left in a moment of stillness. And that stillness had been building for a very long time. If you are watching this because you have done this, because you have gone cold on someone and never looked back, I want you to know something before we go any further. You are not cruel. You are not broken. You are not someone who gives up easily. In fact, the opposite is true. The reason you went cold is precisely because you held on longer than most people would have. You absorbed more. You forgave more. You explained away more. You explained away more. You talked yourself out of your own instincts more times than you can count. And when you finally went cold, it was not abandonment. It was survival. And if you are watching this because someone did this to you, because an empath in your life simply switched off, and you cannot understand why, I want you to stay with me too. Because by the end of this, you are not going to just understand what happened. You are going to understand something about how you showed up that you may never have been asked to look at before. And I say that not to punish you, but because the truth is the only thing that actually helps. So let us start at the beginning, not the moment the empath went cold, the moment long before that, the moment the process began. Because here's what nobody tells you. An empath going cold is not an event. It is the final stage of a process, a long, quiet, often invisible process that started not with anger, but with hope. Every empath who has ever gone cold on someone started out doing the opposite. They started out open. Extraordinarily open. Because empaths do not just feel their own emotions, they feel yours. They walk into a room and they absorb the emotional atmosphere the way other people absorb temperature. They sit across from you and they are not just hearing your words, they are feeling the weight behind them. They notice the pause before you answer. They feel the shift in your energy before your expression changes. They are, whether they chose it or not, tuned into you at a frequency most people do not even know exists. And in the beginning of a relationship, whether that is a friendship, a romantic relationship, or even a family dynamic, that sensitivity feels like connection. Because when someone truly feels you, when someone actually registers your emotions without you having to perform them loudly, it feels like being known. And being known is one of the most fundamental human hungers there is. So the empath shows up fully. They remember what matters to you. They check in without being asked. They feel your hard days in their own body. They hold your pain carefully because they cannot help but feel how heavy it is. They give you the kind of attention that most people spend their entire lives searching for. And they do not do this strategically. They do it because it is simply how they are wired. Because not feeling you is not an option they have. But here is where the dynamic begins to fracture. And this is the part that is not talked about enough. The empath gives all of this feeling, all of this presence, all of this attunement. And very often what they receive in return is not the same quality of attention. It does not have to be dramatic. It does not have to be cruelty. It can be something as quiet as this. The empath shares something vulnerable, and you move on quickly. The empath sets a small boundary, and you make them feel guilty for it. The empath has a hard day, and somehow the conversation still becomes about you. None of these things on their own feel like a crisis. The empath does not storm out. They do not make a scene. They do something far more dangerous. They understand. They tell themselves you are going through something. They tell themselves everyone has patterns. They tell themselves that connection requires patience and that nobody is perfect and that they are probably being too sensitive because they have been told they are too sensitive their entire lives. And that voice, the voice that says your feelings are the problem, is the loudest voice in the room. So they quiet themselves. They adjust. They make themselves smaller. They keep showing up and they keep a record, not intentionally, not vindictively. But the nervous system keeps a record whether you ask it to or not. Every time the empaths silenced themselves to keep the peace, recorded. Every time they felt unseen and said nothing, recorded. Every time they gave generously and received dismissal, recorded. Every time they tried to express a need and were made to feel like a burden, recorded. The body does not forget. Even when the mind forgives, even when the heart tries again, the body keeps the score. And slowly, quietly, beneath all the warmth and all the giving and all the staying, something begins to change. It is not anger, not yet. It is something more subtle. It is a kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix, a heaviness that arrives before you even enter the room, a faint but growing awareness that being around this person costs something, and that the cost has been rising for a long time. The empath does not name this yet. They push through it. They show up again. They try a different approach. They have the conversation one more time, more gently, more carefully, hoping that this time something will land. And then one day, not dramatically, not loudly, it does not work again. And something inside the empath simply goes quiet. That quiet is unlike anything the empath has felt before, because they have felt sadness before. They feel everything before most people do. They have felt disappointment, frustration, longing, grief. But this is different. This is not an emotion. It is the absence of one. It is the moment the nervous system, after years of trying to stay open, makes a decision that the conscious mind has not yet caught up to. And the decision is this: I am no longer available to be hurt here. Psychologists have a term for what happens in the body during prolonged emotional stress that goes unaddressed. They call it shutdown. Not breakdown, shutdown. A breakdown is loud. It is visible. It demands attention and response. A shutdown is silent. It is the system doing what it was designed to do when the cost of staying open becomes higher than the organism can sustain. It is not weakness. It is not coldness. It is the most ancient form of self-protection the human body knows. And for an empath who has been absorbing and processing and holding and giving at a rate that most people cannot even imagine, shutdown does not come quickly. It comes after extraordinary endurance. It comes after the kind of patience that most people would have abandoned months or years earlier. This is what the people left behind almost never understand. They experience the empath's withdrawal as sudden, as cruel, as a punishment being handed down without warning. And from the outside, it can genuinely look that way. 1 week, the empath was warm and present. The next, they are distant, short in their replies, no longer initiating, no longer asking questions they used to ask. And the person on the receiving end is confused, then hurt, then often angry. They say, "You changed." They say, "Where did you go?" They say, "I do not understand what I did." And sometimes when they are less self-aware, they say, "You are being dramatic. You are overreacting. You are punishing me for nothing." But here is the truth that sits underneath all of that confusion. The empath did not change suddenly. The empath changed incrementally, invisibly, over a long period of time. And the person simply was not paying close enough attention to notice, because here is the painful mirror this situation holds up. The empath was always paying attention. That is the entire point. They felt every micro shift in your mood. They noticed every small withdrawal. They registered every moment you were present and every moment you were present. They were reading you constantly. not because they were obsessive, but because that is how their nervous system operates. It is always scanning, always attuned. And this is not an accusation, this is simply an observation about how most people are wired. You were not reading them at the same resolution, not because you did not care, but because most people do not have the same sensitivity dial turned up that high. Most people do not notice a slight shift in someone's tone. Most people do not register the moment someone stops volunteering information they used to share freely. Most people do not feel the change in the room before it becomes a conversation on. So the empath was withdrawing slowly in a language you did not know how to read. And by the time the withdrawal was obvious enough for you to notice, it was already complete. Now here is where this becomes important. And this is the part I promised you that most people never get told. The empath going cold is not actually about you. Not entirely. Yes, you played a role. Yes, patterns in how you showed up contributed to the environment that made staying open feel unsafe. But the empathic going cold is fundamentally about a decision, often unconscious, that the empathic makes about themselves. And that decision sounds like this: I matter too. Because what drives an empath to stay past the point they should, to absorb more than is fair, to keep forgiving what the body is already protesting, is not stupidity. It is not weakness. It is a deeply held belief, usually formed very early in life, that their needs are secondary, that their comfort matters less. That love is something you earn by making yourself endlessly useful and endlessly available. Many empaths grew up in environments where they were only valued for what they gave, their calm, their understanding, their ability to make difficult people feel comfortable. They learned before they had words for it that having needs was a liability, that asking for too much meant losing connection entirely. So they became masters of self-erasure. They became so good at prioritizing everyone else that their own inner world became a place they rarely visited. And for a long time, this works, or at least it functions. The empath moves through relationships feeling vaguely unfulfilled, but attributing that to their own sensitivity, telling themselves they are asking for too much, telling themselves the right person, the right friendship, the right dynamic is just around the corner, and they simply need to be more patient, or understanding, more forgiving. But the body does not agree. The body is filing every instance of self-abandonment. Every moment the empath swallowed something real to keep the surface smooth. And eventually, not suddenly, but eventually, the file gets full. And what happens when an empath finally recognizes, even wordlessly, that they have been abandoning themselves inside a relationship is not rage. It is revelation, a quiet, devastating, clarifying revelation. It often arrives not in a dramatic moment, but in an ordinary one. A mundane Tuesday, a regular conversation. Something small happens, something that on its own would barely register, but it lands on top of everything that came before it. And the empath feels something they have not let themselves feel in a long time. Done. Not done in a way that wants to fight. Done in a way that has nothing left to prove. Done in a way that has already grieved every version of how this could have been different, so that when the moment arrives, there is no explosion, only exit, calm, final, complete. And they go cold, and they do not come back, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started. And this is the part that changes everything. Because once an empath reaches that place, that still, quiet, final place, something shifts in them that goes beyond the relationship they just left. Something shifts in how they understand themselves. For many empaths, going cold on someone is the first time in their lives they have ever chosen themselves without apologizing for it. The first time they have listened to what their body has been saying for months or years and said, yes, I believe you. And that experience, as painful as it is, as lonely as it can feel in the aftermath, is also the beginning of something, a kind of waking up that cannot be undone. But before we get to what comes after, we need to talk about something that does not get discussed enough. Because there's a shadow side to the empath going cold that is rarely examined honestly. And it is this: not every empath who goes cold does so cleanly. Not every withdrawal is purely protective. Sometimes woven into the silence, there is also punishment. Sometimes the coldness is not just self-preservation. It is also a way of making someone feel, finally, what the empath has been feeling all along. And if you are an empath and you have ever done this, I am not here to shame you, but I am here to ask you to be honest with yourself about it. Because there is a difference between a boundary and a weapon. And sometimes in the hands of someone who has been hurt for a long time, silence becomes both at once. The empath who has never learned to express needs directly, who has never been taught that their voice is safe to use, who has spent years swallowing real responses and performing composed ones, that empath sometimes uses disappearance as the only form of communication left. Not because they are malicious, but because they never developed another tool. They never learned how to say, this is what I need, and this is what happens if I do not get it, in a way that felt safe enough to actually try. So they say it the only way they know how, with absence, with silence, with the withdrawal of warmth that used to be unconditional. And here is the uncomfortable truth, sitting inside that. If the empath had been able to use their voice earlier, if they had said directly and clearly, I am not okay with this, and here is what I need instead, some of these relationships might have had a different ending. Not all of them. Some dynamics are simply not safe, and no amount of communication changes a person who has no interest in changing. But some of them, some of the friendships, some of the relationships that ended in silence might have been repaired if the empath had believed their voice was worth using before the shutdown arrived. This is not blame. This is something more useful than blame. This is an invitation, because if you are an empath who recognizes this pattern, who sees yourself in the cycle of overgiving, swallowing, tolerating, shutting down, disappearing, then the work is not just about finding safer people. The work is also about becoming someone who can speak before they disappear, someone who trusts their own needs enough to name them out loud in real time before the body makes the decision that the mouth was too afraid to make. And that work is hard, genuinely hard. Because for most empaths, using their voice directly, saying, I am unhappy, this is not working for me, I need something different, does not feel like communication. It feels like detonation. It feels like the moment everything falls apart. Because somewhere in their history, that is exactly what it was. The child who expressed a need and was punished for it. The teenager who spoke honestly and was told they were too much. The young adult who tried to set a limit and watched the relationship collapse because of it. The nervous system remembers all of it. And so speaking up does not feel like a choice. It feels like a threat. And silence, disappearance, coldness, those feel like safety. But here's what the empath is slowly learning. In the aftermath of every relationship they have walked away from without a word. Safety that is built on silence is not actually safety. It is isolation with better lighting. Because the empath who cannot speak their needs before they disappear will keep disappearing. Will keep cycling through relationships that start with extraordinary warmth and end with inexplicable coldness. Will keep wondering why connection never seems to last, never seems to reach the depth they are craving, never seems to hold. And the answer, the real answer, the one underneath all the reasons about other people, is that you cannot build lasting intimacy with half of yourself, hidden. So what does the empath do with all of this? What is the person who has been trained since childhood to absorb, to give, to endure, to silence? What do they do when they finally understand the pattern they have been living inside? The first thing, and this is not small, is that they grieve it. Not the relationship they left, not just the specific person. They grieve the version of themselves that had to learn to disappear in order to feel safe. They grieve the years of swallowing, the mornings of waking up tired without knowing why, the friendships that faded, not because they were bad friendships, but because the empath never let anyone close enough to know what they actually needed. That grief is real and it deserves to be felt fully, not rushed through in search of a lesson. And then, after the grief, not instead of it, but after it, comes the rebuilding. Not a rebuilding of walls, not a hardening, not the decision to feel less, to care less, to give less, because the empath who decides to solve their pain by shutting down their sensitivity has not healed. They have just found a different way to disappear. The real rebuilding is something far more specific. It is the slow, deliberate practice of learning to stay open and boundaried at the same time, of learning that sensitivity and self-protection are not opposites, that you can feel everything and still know what you will and will not accept, that you can love deeply and still leave when leaving is what your wholeness requires, that you can be warm and have limits at the same time, in the same body, in the same relationship, and that this is not a contradiction. It is, in fact, what emotional maturity actually looks like, because the empath who has done this work, who has grieved, who has looked honestly at the pattern, who has started to rebuild from the inside out, that empath begins to move through the world differently, not louder, not harder, not with walls where warmth used to be, differently in a way that is quieter and more powerful than anything they have shown before. They stop performing availability they do not feel. They stop answering every emotional call at the cost of their own reserves. They stop mistaking familiarity for safety and intensity for depth. And perhaps most importantly, they stop abandoning themselves in slow motion and calling it love. And the people around them notice, not always in ways that are comfortable. Because when an empath who has spent years being endlessly available begins to hold themselves with a little more care, the people who benefited from the old version often experience that shift as a loss, sometimes as a betrayal. They say, "You used to be so warm." They say, "You have changed." They say, "I do not know who you are anymore." And what they mean underneath all of that is, you used to be easier to take from, and now you are not. And I do not know how to be in a relationship with someone who has needs of their own. This is the moment of truth for everyone in the empath's orbit, because the empath changing is not the problem. The empath changing is the solution. The question is whether the people in their life can grow alongside that change, or whether the relationship only ever worked because the empath was willing to be less than whole. And that question answers itself quickly when the empath stops shrinking. The people who stay, who lean in, who rise to meet the fuller version, those are the people worth keeping. The people who punish the empath for taking up space, who withdraw their warmth, the moment the empath starts to have limits. Those people have given the empath the most important information they could possibly receive. And the empath finally knows how to read it. But here's what I want to spend some time on, because this is the piece that gets skipped over in almost every conversation about empaths and emotional withdrawal. What does the empath actually need on the other side of all of this to experience connection that does not eventually cost them everything? Not in theory, not in abstract psychological language. Practically, specifically, what does safe connection actually feel like for an empath who's been through this cycle? It feels like this. It feels like a conversation where you say something true, something small and real and vulnerable, and the other person does not flinch, does not immediately redirect to themselves, does not minimize what you just offered. They simply receive it. They stay with it for a moment. And in that moment, the empath's nervous system registers something it has been scanning for, often without knowing it. I am safe here. This person can hold something real without dropping it, or weaponizing it, or growing uncomfortable and backing away. That moment. as quiet and unremarkable as it may look from the outside, is everything. It is the thing the empath has been searching for in every room they have ever walked into. Not grand gestures, not intensity, not someone who needs them enormously, someone who can simply be present with them without the empath having to manage the experience for everyone involved. And it also feels like this. It feels like being able to say, I need some time. I am overwhelmed. I cannot show up fully right now. And having that be received without punishment, without guilt, without the other person making the empath's need for recovery into a referendum on how much the empath cares about them. Because for an empath, the ability to step back without consequence is not a luxury. It is a requirement. Their nervous system is not built for constant social output. It is built for depth, not volume, for quality, not frequency. And a person who understands this, who does not take the empath's need for solitude as a rejection, is a person the empath can actually stay open to, because they do not have to brace against them. They do not have to manage them. They can simply be honest. And honesty for an empath is the most intimate act there is. This is what the cold was always protecting. Not the empath's pride, not their ego, not some desire to win or punish or control. The cold was protecting this, the possibility of real connection. The kind that does not require the empath to be less than they are, the kind that does not slowly drain them until there is nothing left to give. The cold was a boundary the empath did not yet have the language for. A limit the body set because the voice had not yet learned to. An understanding that does not make every withdrawal justified. It does not mean every relationship that ended in silence could not have been saved with earlier honesty. But it does mean this. The empath was never the villain of the story. They were someone trying in the only way they knew how to survive a dynamic that was costing them more than anyone around them could see. So if you are an empath watching this and you recognize yourself in every word, if you have gone cold on people, if you have disappeared without explanation, if you have stood at the edge of your own warmth and felt it, simply switch off. Here is what I want to leave you with. The sensitivity that makes you go cold is the same sensitivity that makes you capable of the deepest connection most people will ever experience. It is not a flaw with a fix. It is a frequency with a requirement. And a requirement is this. You must stop treating your own inner world as the least important room in the house. You must stop being the last person you check in on. You must stop waiting until shutdown to honor what your body has been trying to tell you since the beginning. Because the goal is not to stop going cold. The goal is to build a life and choose people where cold is never the only option left, where you speak before you disappear, where you trust that your needs, expressed early and clearly, will not destroy the connection, and where you have enough evidence from consistent and safe people to actually believe that, where the warmth you carry so naturally is not endlessly extracted but genuinely exchanged, where you are not the emotional home for everyone else, while your own foundation goes unmaintained, where you are, finally, as careful with yourself as you have always been with everyone else. You were not supposed to know this, not because it was hidden from you maliciously, but because the world that benefits from your endless availability has very little incentive to tell you that you are allowed to stop, that you are allowed to rest, that you are allowed to close the door not in coldness, but in self-knowledge. In the quiet, unshakable understand that you are not here to be endlessly consumed. You are here to connect deeply, honestly, mutually. And anything less than that, no matter how familiar it feels, is something you are now allowed to leave. Not in silence, not anymore, but in the clear, grounded, compassionate voice of someone who finally knows their own worth and does not need anyone else to confirm it before they act. There is a moment nobody warned you about. Not the moment the burnout begins. Not the moment you finally admit you are exhausted in a way that sleep has stopped fixing. Not even the moment you realize you have been carrying other people's pain so long you have forgotten what your own feels like. Those moments, as brutal as they are, at least make sense. They fit inside the story you have been telling yourself about who you are. They confirm the identity. They say, yes, you're the one who feels everything, who stays, who absorbs, who holds. That identity, as heavy as it was at least familiar. It was yours. No. The moment nobody warns you about comes later. It comes on an ordinary Tuesday, or a Sunday afternoon, or during a phone call you have taken 1,000 times before. Someone you love is hurting. You can hear it in their voice, that particular vibration of distress you have spent years learning to read. And you wait. You wait for the familiar surge, the urgency, the pull in your chest that used to feel like a compass needle swinging toward magnetic north, the feeling that said, move, fix, respond, be what they need right now. And it does not come. There is just silence where that feeling used to live, a stillness so complete, it frightens you more than any amount of overwhelm ever did, because overwhelm at least meant you were still you. This silence means something you are not ready to name. And so you do what empaths do when something threatens the story. You push harder. You manufacture the response. You say the right words, you show up in the right ways, and somewhere behind your eyes you are watching yourself perform a version of yourself that used to be real and is now terrifyingly a costume. That is where this begins, not at the burnout, after it. This video is not about why empaths burn out. There are 1,000 videos about that. This video is about what happens on the other side of the burning, when the person who walks out of the fire does not recognize the person who walked in, when the transformation is so fundamental, so disorienting, so complete, that the word change feels laughably insufficient, when what has happened is not change, but replacement, not evolution, but rupture, not growth, but the shattering of oneself and the slow, bewildering assembly of another. This is about the last identity change. And the reason it is the last one is not because nothing will ever change again. Life will keep moving. You will keep evolving. But this particular shift from the empath who gave without limit to the one who finally irrevocably cannot, this one reorganizes everything underneath. It changes the operating system, not just the applications. After this, the way you relate to people, to emotion, to your own needs, to love itself, is different in ways that cannot be undone. And that is exactly as terrifying and as magnificent as it sounds. Let us start with what you were, because to understand what the burned empath becomes, you have to understand the architecture of what existed before, not just the behavior, but the belief system beneath it. The empath before burnout was not simply a kind person. Kindness is a choice. What the empath had was something older, more structural, more involuntary than kindness. It was a nervous system calibrated from early in life to treat other people's emotional states as primary data. Before you could consciously process a situation, your body had already answered the most important question. What does this person need from me right now? That calibration did not happen in a vacuum. For most empaths, it was learned, not in the way you learn a language or a skill, but in the way a young tree learns to grow around an obstacle, slowly, silently in response to a condition that was simply present and had to be accommodated. Maybe the household you grew up in had a parent whose moods were unpredictable and required constant reading. Maybe love in your early experience arrived in proportion to how well you managed someone else's emotional experience. Maybe you were the peacemaker in a family that needed one, the steady one in a group that leaned on you, the strong one in every room you entered, not because you asked for the role, but because you were good at it. And the world is not shy about using people for what they are good at. Over time, that early calibration became identity. The skill became the self, and the self became defined not by what it felt, but by what it could do with what others felt. You were not a person who happened to be empathic. You were empathy, structured into a human body, walking through a world that had 1,000 uses for that and very little interest in what it cost you. That is the foundation. That is the architecture that burnout eventually dismantles. And here is the thing about dismantling. It does not feel like liberation when it begins. It feels like loss. It feels like malfunction. It feels, to the empath experiencing it, like the most essential part of them is simply going offline. The sensitivity that defined them, the attunement that made them feel capable and needed and real stops firing the way it used to. And without it, the question underneath every empath's surface, the one they have been successfully drowning out with purpose and function and usefulness for years, finally rises loud enough to hear. If I am not the one who feels for everyone else, who am I? That question is the beginning of the last identity change. And it is the most important question you will ever be terrified to answer. That question does not arrive politely. It does not knock. It does not wait for you to be ready to have the right support around you, to be in a stable enough place to handle the excavation it demands. It arrives in the wreckage. It arrives when you are already at your most depleted, your most confused, your most unrecognizable to yourself. It arrives precisely when you have the fewest resources to face it, which is not an accident. That question was always there, buried under the velocity of giving. Burnout does not create the question. It simply removes everything you were using to avoid it. And the first thing most empaths do when that question surfaces is panic, not dramatic, visible panic. Empaths are extraordinarily skilled at invisible suffering. The panic is internal, quiet, and relentless. It sounds like this: something is wrong with me. It sounds like, I used to care so deeply and now I feel almost nothing, which must mean I am broken, damaged, hollowed out in some permanent way that cannot be repaired. It sounds like the most valuable thing about me is gone and I do not know how to exist without it. This is the cruelest phase of the empath transformation. Not because the pain is the worst it will ever be, but because the story being told about the pain is completely wrong. The empath, then, in this phase, is not broken. They are not damaged. They are not losing their humanity or their capacity for love or their fundamental nature. What is actually happening is something so counterintuitive that the mind resists it even when presented with the evidence directly. What is actually happening is that the nervous system is finally, mercifully, correctly prioritizing. For years, sometimes decades, the empath's nervous system operated in a state of what researchers call chronic hypervigilance. This is not a metaphor. This is a measurable, documentable physiological condition in which the threat detection systems of the brain and body remain perpetually activated, scanning the environment for emotional data, processing it at high speed, and generating responses before the conscious mind has even registered the stimulus. In the empath, this system was not primarily scanning for physical danger. It was scanning for emotional distress in others. It was reading microexpressions, tonal shifts, changes in body language, and visible tensions in rooms, and it was doing this continuously, automatically, without rest. The metabolic cost of this is staggering. The human nervous system was not designed to run that process indefinitely. It was designed to activate in response to genuine threat, resolve the situation, and return to baseline. The empath system never returned to baseline. The threat, other people's pain, discomfort, need, conflict was omnipresent. And so the system stayed on for years, burning through resources that were never adequately replenished because the empath was too busy replenishing everyone else. Burnout at the neurological level is the system finally forcing a shutdown that the empath was never going to choose voluntarily. The emotional numbness is not the death of empathy. It is a mandatory power down. The flatness, the disconnection, the strange inability to summon the urgency that used to come so automatically, these are not symptoms of something going wrong. They are symptoms of something, for the first time in a very long time, going right. The body is enforcing what the mind refused to enforce. The circuit breaker is finally tripped, not because the system is failing, but because the system is, against all odds, still smart enough to protect itself. Understanding this does not make it feel better immediately. Knowledge rarely does, when the experience underneath it is still raw, but it plants something important, a seed of a different story, not the story that says you are broken, the story that says you are finally physically being forced to stop. And stopping for an empath is not the end of something. It is the prerequisite for everything. Because here is what nobody tells you about the empath in the shutdown phase. Underneath the numbness, something extraordinary is quietly beginning. While the surface is still and flat, while the old responses are offline, and the familiar emotional current has gone quiet, the deeper architecture is being redesigned. The maps are being redrawn, not just metaphorically at the level of neural pathways, at the level of the stories the nervous system tells itself about what is dangerous and what is safe, about whose pain requires a response and whose pain is simply the weather of being human, about where the self ends and another person begins. The empath is, for the first time, developing a border, not a wall. This distinction matters enormously, and it is one the empath in burnout almost always gets wrong initially. A wall is built from fear. It says, I cannot handle what is on the other side, so I will not let it through. A wall is rigid, indiscriminate, and ultimately isolating. A wall makes you safe by making you separate. An empath who builds a wall after burnout does not transform. They simply trade one dysfunction for another, replacing the compulsion to absorb everything with the compulsion to feel nothing. A border is something entirely different. A border is built from knowledge. It says, I know what belongs to me and what does not. It says, I can feel you without becoming you. It says, your pain is real and I can hold space for it without hollowing myself out to create that space. A border is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling with an address. It knows where it came from. It knows who it belongs to. And it does not confuse proximity with responsibility. The development of that border is the essential project of the empath's transformation. And it begins, and this is the part that confuses people most, not with learning how to keep things out, but with learning how to staying in the self, maintaining the thread back to your own experience, even when someone else's experience is louder, more urgent, more emotionally compelling than yours. Because the empath's original wound was not that they felt too much. The wound was that they consistently abandoned their own feeling in favor of someone else's. The wound was that their own inner life was always automatically the thing that got set aside. Healing that wound does not mean feeling less. It means, for the first time, feeling yourself as much as you feel everyone else. That sounds simple. It is not. For someone who has spent years, sometimes the majority of their conscious life, oriented outward, the act of turning attention inward is not natural. It is not comfortable. It does not feel like relief, at least not at first. It feels with a disorientation that is difficult to overstate, like loneliness. Because the empath's entire relational identity was built on the experience of attunement, that profound, almost electric sense of being deeply connected to the emotional reality of others. That attunement was painful and exhausting and ultimately unsustainable, but it was also, in its way, intimate. It was contact. It was proof of connection. It was, for many empaths, the closest thing to belonging they had ever reliably known. When the hypervigilance system powers down and that constant attunement goes quiet, what replaces it does not immediately feel like freedom. It feels like silence in a room where music has been playing for so long you forgot it was there. And silence, to someone who built their entire sense of self around responsiveness, around being needed, around being the emotional scent of every room they entered, that silence can feel like abandonment. Not of others, of yourself, by yourself. This is the phase where many empaths give up on the transformation, not because they want to go back to burning out. They do not. Exhaustion alone is enough to ensure they have no appetite for a return to that. But because the alternative, this strange, quiet, unfamiliar experience of simply being present in their own life without the constant hum of other people's needs filling every available space, does not yet feel like anything worth choosing. It just feels empty. And empaths, who are among the most meaning-hungry people alive, find emptiness almost physically intolerable. So they fill it. Old patterns, even destructive ones, are enormously seductive when the alternative is sitting with discomfort that has no clear resolution. Some empaths fill the silence by finding a new person to fix, a new crisis to manage, a new relationship where their overgiving can feel purposeful rather than compulsive. Some fill it with the appearance of self-work, consuming enormous amounts of content about healing while carefully avoiding the actual experience of it. Some fill it with self-criticism, which is at least familiar and keeps the internal focus on something concrete, even if that something is their own supposed inadequacy. And some, the ones who make it through, learn to simply sit in it. This is not a passive act. Sitting in the discomfort of your own becoming requires a quality of courage that the world rarely names correctly. The world celebrates the empath who rushes in, the one who shows up at 2 a.m., who gives without asking, who loves loudly and without reservation. That person gets called brave. The empath who sits alone with the silence of their own transformation, who refuses to fill it with another performance of selflessness, who stays present. With the emptiness long enough to discover it is not actually empty. That person is doing something far more difficult. But there are no celebrations for it. There's no one calling to say, I see how hard you are working at the most invisible labor of your life. That recognition will have to come from inside, and learning to give it to yourself is part of the transformation. Here is what begins to emerge when the empath stays with the silence long enough. The first thing is sensation, not emotional sensation. That is still muted, still in the process of recalibrating. Physical sensation. The empath begins to notice, with a clarity that can feel almost shocking, the experience of being in a body, the weight of their own hands, the way tension collects in specific places, the jaw, the shoulders, the chest, and what that tension is responding to. The difference between hunger that belongs to them and hunger they absorb from a room. The physical signature of their own emotions versus the physical signature of emotions they took on from others without ever being asked. This sounds small. It is not small at all. For an empath who spent years dissociated from their own physical experience, and most highly empathic people have some degree of dissociation from the body, because the body was the instrument of everyone else's experience, and attending to it as your own felt indulgent, selfish. Beside the point, reconnecting with physical sensation is the beginning of an entirely new relationship with the self. The body becomes, perhaps for the first time, a home rather than a tool. The second thing that emerges is preference. Empaths in their overgiving phase often have a genuinely difficult time answering simple questions. What do you want to eat? What kind of movie do you feel like? What do you need right now? These questions, which most people answer automatically from a simple internal read, require an empath to first locate themselves underneath the ambient noise of everyone else's preferences. And if that process was never practiced, if the habit of deferring to others was established early and reinforced constantly, The honest answer to what do you want is often, I genuinely do not know. In the silence of post-burnout, preferences begin to surface, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, persistent ways. A sudden clarity about a food you actually dislike and have been eating for years because someone else liked it. A realization that a friendship you maintained out of loyalty has been quietly draining you for a decade. A desire, tentative and new, to spend an afternoon doing something that has no utility for anyone other than yourself. These small emergences of preference are not trivial. They are the first evidence of something that the empath urgently needs to believe and has not yet been able to, that their inner life is real, valid, worth attending to, and fully as important as anyone else's. The third thing that emerges is anger. This one surprises most empaths. They expected grief. Grief is familiar. Grief fits the empath's emotional repertoire. Grief is something they have plenty of practice metabolizing for other people. But anger is different. Anger, for the empath, has historically been dangerous. In the early environments where many empaths developed their hypervigilance, anger, particularly their own anger, was not safe to express. It disrupted the peace. It made them less likable, less manageable, less useful. And so it was suppressed, redirected, transformed into excessive understanding and generous explanation for every person who ever failed them. In the post-burnout silence, that suppressed anger begins to surface, and it is enormous, not violent, not destructive, but large. Years, sometimes deaths of unacknowledged injury, compressed into something the empath barely has language for because they spent so long insisting everything was fine. The anger at years of one-sided giving, the anger at people who accepted endlessly without ever asking what it cost, the anger at a version of themselves so thoroughly convinced of their own secondariness that they participated willingly and actively in their own depletion. That anger is not something to manage or minimize or rush through. That anger is information. It is the nervous system finally telling the truth about what happened. And it needs to be heard, not performed, not weaponized, not directed outward in ways that create new damage, but heard internally with the same quality of compassionate attention the empath has given everyone else for years. Because on the other side of that anger is something the empath has been waiting for their entire life, the knowledge that they matter, not because of what they give, not because of what they can absorb or fix or hold or manage, not because of their usefulness or their availability or their extraordinary capacity for attunement, but simply because they are here, because they are a person, because the fact of their own experience is, all by itself, sufficient reason for it to be honored. That knowledge, once it arrives, changes everything. But knowledge, even the most essential kind, does not arrive and immediately reorganize a life. It arrives as a whisper first, a fragile, tentative signal that the empath almost misses because they have spent so long tuned to everyone else's frequency that their own is barely recognizable. It arrives in small moments, a pause before saying yes to something that used to get an automatic yes, a hesitation before picking up a phone call from someone who has historically left them feeling hollowed out, a quiet internal no, that's sir, faces before the performative yes can override it. And this time, just this once, the empath notices it before it disappears. These moments are easy to dismiss. They do not feel like transformation. They feel like bad days. They feel like selfishness. They feel, to the empath who is still carrying years of conditioning that told them their own needs were the least urgent thing in any room, like failure. Because the internal critic, that voice that was installed early and has been running commentary ever since, does not go quiet just because the empath has intellectually understood that they deserve to matter. The critic is not interested in intellectual understanding. The critic runs on something much older and much more stubborn than insight. It runs on the original wound. And to understand why these early moments of self-honoring feel so threatening, so guilt-soaked, so loaded with a sense of wrongness that can be almost physical in its intensity, you have to understand what that original wound actually is, because it is not, at its core, a wound of overfeeling. It is not simply that the empath feels too much. The wound in most cases is a wound of conditional belonging. It is the early learned equation that said, you are accepted here, you are loved here, you are safe here, but only when you are useful, only when you are managing, soothing, absorbing, accommodating, only when your presence is making someone else's experience better. That equation, absorbed in childhood or early adulthood in environments that required it, does not stay conscious, it sinks. It becomes the water the empath swims in, invisible, foundational, the assumed terms of every relationship they enter. They do not walk into new connections thinking, I must earn my place here through emotional labor. They simply begin earning it automatically because the nervous system learned long ago this is what safety requires, this is what love requires, this is the price of belonging. The post-burnout transformation at its deepest level is the renegotiation of that original equation. And that renegotiation is not primarily an intellectual exercise. You cannot think your way out of a wound that was never installed through thinking. You cannot reason with a nervous system that learned its lessons in the wordless pre-verbal territory of early experience. The renegotiation happens in relationship, in real lived encounters where the empaths test slowly and with enormous internal resistance, whether belonging is actually conditional on usefulness. This is where the transformation becomes visible to others, and where it becomes, for a period, actively destabilizing to the people around the empath. Because the people in the empath's life built their relationships with this person on a particular set of expectations, not maliciously, in most cases, not consciously. But when someone has been the emotional anchor of every dynamic they inhabit, the people attached to them inevitably arrange themselves around that anchor. They lead, they expect, they begin to rely on the empath's responsiveness in ways that feel, from the inside, like closeness, like the natural intimacy of a relationship where one person can be fully known. What they do not see, because the empath was too skilled at hiding it, is the cost. They do not see the exhaustion. They do not see the performance. They do not see the person behind the role slowly disappearing into it. And so when the empathy begins to change, when the yes becomes sometimes, when the availability becomes conditional, when the emotional labor is no longer automatic and free and unlimited, the people around them do not experience this as their beloved person finally taking care of themselves. They experience it as withdrawal, as coldness, as a fundamental change in the relationship that nobody agreed to and nobody asked for. Some of them say this directly, you have changed. You are not the person you used to be. I miss the old you. What they mean, though they rarely understand this about themselves, is I miss the version of you that was easier to need. I miss the version that never asked me to sit with the discomfort of your limits. I miss the arrangement. And here is where the empath faces the most brutal test of the transformation, because the empath still loves these people. That is the part that nobody outside this experience fully grasps. The transformation does not eliminate love. It does not install cynicism or indifference or the comfortable numbness of not caring anymore. The empath comes out of this process feeling, if anything, more capable of genuine love than before, because the love is no longer contaminated by the anxious need to be needed, by the fear of abandonment that drove so much of the giving, by the compulsive quality that made even the most generous acts about managing internal terror rather than freely choosing connection. But that love now coexists with something it never had before. A limit, not a limit on the love itself, a limit on the behavior love can require. A clear, felt, unambiguous internal line that says, I can love you and still not be available for this. I can care deeply about your pain and still not take responsibility for resolving it. I can want the best for you and still say no to the thing you're asking of me right now. I can be your person and still not be your solution. For relationships built on the old arrangement, that limit is incompatible with the structure. These relationships, and there are always some in every empath's life, do not survive the transformation. Not because the empath stops trying, not because love runs out, but because love runs out, because the relationship was never actually built on love. It was built on function. The empathy was the function. And when the function is no longer available on the old terms, there is nothing underneath it to hold the structure up. The recognition of this is one of the most painful moments in the entire process, because the empath grieved these relationships before they officially ended. They grieved them during the burnout. When they first began to sense the asymmetry, they had been too exhausted and too invested to see clearly before. They grieved the version of them that was genuine versus the version that was convenient. They grieved the years already spent. And now they grieve the ending, the formal, undeniable ending of something they wanted to be real. And that turned out to be, at its foundation, transactional. That grief does not resolve quickly. It should not be asked to, but underneath it, for the empath willing to stay present with the full weight of it, rather than escape into a new performance of strength. Something is quietly happening. The weight is different now. The grief belongs to them completely. It is not mixed with anyone else's feelings. It is not contaminated by the need to manage how their sadness lands on others. For perhaps the first time in their emotional life, they are having an experience that is entirely, purely, unapologetically their own. And that, even in the middle of loss, is the beginning of something that feels faintly but unmistakably like freedom.